In 1876, in Coldwater, Michigan, Father Silas Lucas was found unconscious beneath the altar of St. Odilo Parish, his cassock drenched with lamp oil, and his palms blistered as if seared by heated metal. Scattered around him were 12 charred wooden artifacts once displayed in glass cases. Now smashed and blackened, their labels peeled away or burned. A devout and soft-spoken priest of German descent with pale skin and an unusual aversion to touch, Father Lucas had served the community without scandal for nearly a decade, tending to the sick and poor with an almost obsessive routine. Parishioners described him as stern but comforting, a man who never raised his voice yet never smiled. Saint. Odilo had been built in 1862 with funds from a defunct tannery syndicate and stood on reclaimed swampland where the church basement remained damp and inexplicably warm year-round, even during Michigan's brutal winters. By 1884, diocesan ledgers recorded an unusual volume of incoming crates marked Donativo arriving from Europe, despite no official fundraising campaigns or missionary affiliations. Why did Father Lucas request no help during the fire? And why were none of the artifacts ever listed in parish records? Respected by the diocese for his spotless administrative record and discreet pastoral manner, Father Lucas wore thick wool gloves even in summer and was rarely seen without a scarf, citing poor circulation. But a 1887 customs manifest filed under his name listed 216 pounds of undocumented cargo from Venice, prompting a quiet inquiry by a diocesan archivist that would unveil a disturbing pattern of destruction and silence. The earliest known complaint against Father Lucas's parish did not come from within the congregation, but from an unlikely source: the county carpenter, Willis Beach, who was contracted in March of 1877 to inspect a warped floorboard in the vestry. Beach later testified in a civil affidavit that he was not permitted to enter the church until twilight, and that, once inside, he was instructed by Father Lucas himself to complete the task without unsealing or moving a cedar crate resting beneath the faulty board. Beach described the interior of the vestry as stiflingly hot, with the scent of scorched resin clinging to the walls. The floor creaked in long, sustained whines even when no weight was applied, and the entire space trembled slightly, as if from an underground bellows. He left before finishing the job. That same spring, a series of letters began circulating among the elderly parishioners, written in tight cursive and always unsigned. One was delivered to Martha Rowe, a widow and long-time organist, tucked into her hymnal just before Sunday Mass. It read, in part, "He keeps them awake and they keep him still." Another appeared in the sacristy drawer, folded within a requisition form, and contained only 4 words: "No oil, no flame." Father Lucas, when questioned about the notes by Parish Secretary Emery Fielding, dismissed them as the work of local children or Protestant pranksters, though no one could recall seeing any youths lingering near the church grounds after hours. St. Odilo stood isolated at the edge of the marsh flats, its red brick exterior darkened by age and mildew. The steeple tilted slightly eastward from foundation erosion. In late summer, dragonflies swarmed its windows in thick, humming clusters, and the smell of wet leather often hung in the air inexplicably strong inside the nave. One visiting priest from Marshall, Father Reginald Dorr, noted in his journal after a brief overnight stay that he found a sense of muffled motion behind the walls, like burlap sacks dragging over damp stone. His entry was dated September 19, 1877, and was the final notation before the rest of the page was torn out. Church attendance did not decline immediately. In fact, 1878 showed a modest increase in donations and tithes, largely due to the influx of Bavarian immigrants settling on the city's north end. Many found Father Lucas familiar and trustworthy, and they appreciated his homilies, which increasingly focused on themes of silence, humility, and fire, as a tool of spiritual cleansing. A few of these families, particularly the Kriegers and the Froschs, became regular volunteers, aiding with church maintenance and weekly cleaning of the sanctuary. It was 12-year-old Clara Frosch who first mentioned the low voices coming from the reliquary cases in the back alcove. During confession in April 1879, she told Father Lucas that sometimes the carved wooden busts of saints murmured things when her mother passed them with the incense burner. Father Lucas, according to Clara's mother, grew visibly pale and instructed the girl never to speak of it again, reminding her sternly that holy things do not speak unless we ask them to. Clara was not allowed to return to the sacristy after that, and the alcove was sealed with a velvet curtain sewn shut at the edges. In the following months, several alterations were made to the interior without the diocese's permission. Candles were removed from the sanctuary and replaced with thick hand-dipped oil lamps that emitted a sickly greenish glow. The Stations of the Cross, once painted in soft pastels, were redone in stark black and ochre, the figures distorted and gaunt, with disproportionately large eyes. Most notably, a crude iron grate was installed in front of the basement stairwell, welded directly to the wall. The stairs themselves, once open to volunteers and altar boys, were now off-limits. It was Emery Fielding, the parish secretary, who finally contacted the bishop's office in Detroit. In a carefully worded letter dated December 2, 1880, Fielding expressed concern about the increasing number of nighttime deliveries arriving at St. Odilo. He noted the frequency, twice per month, always on Fridays, always from the same carriage bearing a faded crest resembling a serpent coiled around a lantern. Fielding stated that he was no longer permitted to assist in the unloading of shipments, which were handled entirely by Father Lucas and two men he referred to only as the archivists. According to Fielding, these men never spoke and wore identical coats of grey wool with no visible seams. Bishop Mallory did not reply. Records from the Detroit Archdiocese show that the letter was received, stamped, and filed, but no official action was taken. By 1881, the women of the congregation began to voice subtle but growing unease. Several choir members, including Hannah Keating and Ruth Meyer, complained of frequent dizziness and nosebleeds after long hours in the loft. One woman fainted during Mass, and upon waking claimed she saw a wall of teeth in place of the altar. She later retracted the statement. More than one child became ill after playing near the sacristy and complained of a burning smell stuck to their clothing. Outside the church, the landscape changed. Grass grew thin and yellow near the foundation. Trees along the property line withered despite wet seasons. Animals, especially strays, avoided the area entirely. According to the city veterinarian's logs from 1882, at least 6 dogs were found dead within 100 feet of the building over the span of 2 months, with no signs of physical trauma. The interior, too, seemed altered in subtle but unmistakable ways. Marble surfaces began to stain with brownish streaks that could not be scrubbed clean. Wooden pews, once polished regularly, developed an oily residue that left black marks on parishioners' gloves and sleeves. The baptismal font cracked vertically down the middle without impact, and the statue of St. Michael behind the altar was found one morning with its eyes gouged out. No entry point was discovered. Despite these events, Father Lucas's public composure never wavered. He continued to preach calmly and with authority, his homilies turning more cryptic, laced with obscure Latin phrases and references to divine fermentation and sacred unmaking. He conducted all sacraments himself and gradually dismissed all lay helpers, except for the Krieger boys, who by 1883 had taken up residence in the former rectory shed. It was around this time that a cold, persistent vibration began to hum through the stone floor during early morning Mass. Those seated closest to the altar often complained of aching joints and, in one case, temporary hearing loss. The source was never found. No formal investigation occurred until July of 1884, when a traveling Dominican friar named Leo Bernat was granted a one-night stay in Coldwater while en route to Chicago. Bernat had received several unsigned letters detailing irregularities at St. Odilo and decided to attend Mass in plain clothes to observe. His personal diary, later found among his effects at a monastery in Indiana, described an overwhelming and unexplainable smell of boiling ink upon entering the church, and a moment during the liturgy when he saw Father Lucas's shadow stretch across the floor in the wrong direction, bending against the angle of the oil lamps. The next morning, Bernat requested an interview with the priest. He was refused. That evening, Bernat boarded a train west and never returned to Michigan. On August 5, 1884, Father Lucas ordered the bell tower sealed. Without notice or explanation, The external access stairwell was dismantled, and the door from the choir loft bolted from the inside. When questioned by Emery Fielding, he stated only that the bell no longer signifies holiness. From that day forward, time was marked solely by Father Lucas's own voice, which signaled the start of Mass with a sharp, rhythmic chant rather than a peal. The townspeople grew accustomed to the silence, but several noted how the air around the tower thickened in the evenings, carrying a faint metallic scent and the sensation of static before lightning. In the church's archive room, a small ledger bound in cracked black leather began to accumulate entries with increasing frequency. This was the Relic Registry, a book used since 1863 to catalogue all sacred objects within the building. Prior to 1884, entries had been sparse and formal, usually just naming the item, its origin, and the date of acquisition. But beginning in September of that year, the script changed, tighter, more frantic. The entries multiplied rapidly, and many lacked origins or any reference to saints. One page, dated October 3rd, listed 7 separate items with only vague descriptors. Wooden disc with socket, calcined segment of vertebrae, metal clasp with interior root structure. No diocesan approval or provenance was recorded. One of the Krieger boys, Otto, then 19, was seen carrying an object wrapped in thick oilcloth from the side entrance of the church to the storage shed late one evening. A neighbour, Harriet Macomb, who lived 2 plots down, recounted that he dropped the bundle briefly while fumbling with the door, and that it made a wet clicking sound like hollow bone. She was dismissed as a gossip by most, but her description of the boy's appearance, drenched in sweat despite the autumn chill, eyes unfocused, matched later notes taken by the city apothecary, who treated Otto for sudden, unexplained skin eruptions on both forearms. By winter, the church interior had grown darker, lamps flickered inconsistently and were replaced more often than seemed reasonable. Parish expenditures reflected this. In the January 1885 financial report, over 60% of discretionary funds were allocated to oil imports and wick replacement. Despite this, Father Lucas insisted on evening services, sometimes as late as 10 o'clock, and delivered homilies to nearly empty pews, speaking in low, elaborate monologues that often contained no clear scriptural reference. A surviving letter from Ruth Meyer to her cousin in Chicago describes attending one such mass alone, writing, "He spoke for nearly an hour about roots that grow upward and the memory of wood. I understood none of it, but I could not move. The physical condition of the building declined. Plaster peeled in strips from the eastern transept, brass fixtures dulled to a greenish hue, and a dark residue began to form on the edges of the altar rail. At least 3 members of the congregation reported finding fine black dust on their hands and faces after attending communion. When rubbed between the fingers, it left a sticky, foul-smelling smear. One man, Jethro Miles, a stonemason and self-declared non-believer, entered the church on contract to reinforce the basement supports in February 1885. He lasted only a single afternoon before abandoning the project. According to his own written statement submitted to the Coldwater Municipal Office, he discovered 2 adjacent storage vaults bricked up behind false panels. One had been partially dismantled from the inside. Miles wrote, "I heard something in there. It wasn't animal, it wasn't human either. It was as if something was rearranging itself without knowing how." He refused to return and was paid only for the hours worked. The sealed crates in the nave began to increase in number. Parishioners grew uneasy, seeing them stacked against the walls, some marked only with cryptic letters or foreign stamps. The largest, delivered in May 1885, bore a Venetian merchant seal long out of use. Its arrival was not acknowledged by any official record, but it appeared in an anonymous photograph developed that summer, which shows the crate near the altar, with what appears to be a thin trail of liquid seeping from beneath it. The photograph was found years later in the back pages of a schoolteacher's journal, without caption. A lingering sense of anticipation settled over the parish. Services were shorter, and those who remained loyal to Father Lucas, now reduced to a core of 15 or 20, spoke less openly. Confessionals were removed, replaced by private appointments in the rectory. When Emery Fielding inquired about the alteration, he was told that secrets needed better casing. That same month, Fielding tendered his resignation and moved to Jackson, never again speaking of his time at St. Odilo. Without an official secretary, records grew sparse. The diocesan yearbook for 1886 lists the parish simply as active, without financial or sacramental detail. Yet according to tax logs and municipal storage permits, activity increased. More shipments, more closed-door evenings, more repairs conducted by unknown laborers during off-hours. Father Lucas stopped attending clergy meetings altogether. When Bishop Mallory sent Father Ansel Reeve to inquire, he was received only in the antechamber and dismissed after 10 minutes. Reeve's written impression: "I have never seen a man so alert and so absent at once. He listened like someone taking inventory." Behind the church, the marshland continued to change. Locals spoke of shallow sinkholes forming without rain. Frogs and waterfowl vanished entirely from the surrounding 2 acres. One boy, Jacob Lang, fell waist-deep into a collapsed section near the western edge of the property and had to be pulled free by his older brother. His skin reportedly burned where it contacted the water. His trousers, made of thick canvas, dissolved in patches by the time he was pulled out. Inside the church, more strange notations appeared in the relic ledger. Several were written not in English or Latin, but in an archaic German dialect rarely used in religious texts. One phrase repeated several times in different entries: Die Sammlung atmet. Translation: the collection breathes. Despite the growing signs of deterioration and unease, no intervention came. The congregation, though thinned, held fast to ritual, some out of fear, others perhaps drawn to the solemn authority that Father Lucas continued to project. He rarely spoke outside the pulpit now, and when he did, his words were brief and formal. He addressed parishioners not by name but by assigned seating row. Physical contact ceased entirely. By the close of 1886, the rear of the church was no longer accessible to anyone, except Father Lucas and the Krieger boys, now pale and reclusive, seen only during late evening errands to the apothecary or the post station. One neighbor claimed they spoke in whispers even when outdoors. Another, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Elaine Dray, said she once heard one of them muttering what sounded like repeated syllables while staring into a rain barrel. When she asked him what he was saying, he simply turned and smiled with blue-stained teeth. No funerals were held at St. Odilo in 1886. This fact appears in both the diocesan death registry and Coldwater's town records. Deaths occurred, but burials were rerouted to other churches or conducted graveside without clerical presence. The absence was noted but never explained. Then, in the first days of January 1887, the relic ledger stopped. The final entry, dated January 3rd, read only, "Seal them as they were found." In the spring of 1887, Reverend Charles Vey, a rising figure in the Michigan diocese, known for his work on liturgical compliance, was dispatched discreetly to Coldwater. The bishop's letter of commission, dated March 12th, described his visit as an informal seasonal review, though an attached personal note in the margin read, "Re-evaluate the condition of St. Odilo. Confirm or deny rumors of relic mismanagement." Vey arrived by train on March 22nd and was lodged not in the rectory as was customary, but in a rented room at the Morris boarding house 2 streets away. Father Lucas did not meet him at the station. He sent Otto Krieger instead, who said only, "He will receive you after Vespers." Reverend Vey's personal diary, now preserved at the diocesan archives, recorded his initial impressions with unease. "The church gives no outward sign of decay," he wrote that evening, "but I felt watched the moment I crossed the threshold. There is a smell I cannot name, chemical, like scorched parchment and brine. I spoke to no one within. Even the Krieger boy left me at the door." Vey noted the locked choir loft, the absence of daylight inside the nave, and the presence of long, low crates behind the altar. He was not shown their contents. His inspection lasted 3 days. Each evening he returned to his boarding room and added more pages to his report, though only fragments survived. Several were torn or ink-washed, and many bore lines struck through repeatedly. One surviving paragraph reads, "He, Lucas, prays over the objects, but not as blessings. He reads to them. It is neither Latin nor German, I know. He touches nothing with bare hands." On the morning of March 25th, Vey attempted to photograph the sanctuary using a portable dry plate camera. He had obtained permission from the diocesan secretary and brought with him fresh glass plates and chemicals. But none of the 12 exposures developed. Each returned as a blot of distorted swirls, with one plate cracking during the rinse. He later described the failure as a visual obstruction, as if the room itself refused to imprint. That night he did not sleep. In his final journal entry, Vey wrote, "It is louder below. I am no longer convinced it is water." The next morning he boarded a train to Kalamazoo. Within a week he resigned from diocesan service without explanation. He never spoke publicly of St. Odilo again. Following his abrupt withdrawal, pressure within the bishopric began to mount. Financial records from the parish were incomplete. The church had ceased sending regular reports. No one from the congregation had attended regional faith councils in over a year. On April 4, 1887, the diocese approved a second, less conspicuous line of inquiry, this time through a secular proxy. Elias Thorne, a former court clerk turned investigative assistant for the Western Michigan Ecclesiastical Review, was sent to Coldwater, posing as a restoration consultant. He arrived with forged credentials and a false name, Mr. Elwood Tynes, and presented himself to Father Lucas with a letter of referral from a fictitious benefactor in Chicago. He was granted permission to inspect the outer structure and given a seat near the back during services. Thorne kept meticulous notes in a field journal, most of which survived due to his habit of posting carbon copies to a colleague in Grand Rapids. He described the church interior as perpetually moist, not humid but wet, as if stone held water in its lungs. He observed that Father Lucas entered and exited through a separate passage behind the altar, and that none of the parishioners, now fewer than 10 at each service, made eye contact with him. Their lips move in unscripted repetition, Thorne wrote. They are not responding to him. They are mirroring him. During one of his nighttime inspections, Thorne gained brief access to the vestibule storage chamber, using a copied key provided by a sympathetic city clerk who had previously done maintenance work at St. Odilo. Inside, he discovered a wall lined with shelves holding small sealed jars, each with a numbered label, but no corresponding inventory. One had cracked, and a resinous substance had seeped down onto the wood, eating away the varnish. The odor, he reported, induced a migraine so severe I dropped the lantern. He took no samples. The next day he developed conjunctivitis in both eyes and returned to his lodging with blurred vision and fever. Meanwhile, back in Detroit, contradictory reports began to circulate among the diocese's mid-level clerical staff. Father Reeve, who had visited St. Odilo a year earlier, claimed in a written statement that he had never been inside the church itself, despite prior documentation stating otherwise. The diocesan archivist, Sister Adelind, discovered that 2 volumes of property transactions involving St. Odilo had been removed from the public shelf and replaced with forged indexes, omitting all entries between 1884 and 1886. A quiet reprimand was issued, but no investigation followed. In July of that year, a local journalist, Margaret Delaney, published a short piece in the Coldwater Bulletin titled "The Church That Won't Let Go." It was a curious mix of observation and folklore, describing the church's odd sleep schedule, the boxes that groan, and a recurring incident where passers-by claimed to see the same woman enter the building each morning, despite no one ever seeing her leave. The article was pulled from the next issue, and Delaney received a formal warning from her publisher. According to her personal letters, she was visited the following week by 2 men in clerical suits who questioned her at length about her sources, and then left without identifying themselves. By the end of 1887, the Coldwater Municipal Council proposed rerouting the service road behind St. Odilo due to recurring sinkholes and soil instability. City engineer Thomas Roke conducted the preliminary survey. His field notes mention that ground-penetrating rods inserted near the church's eastern wall encountered sudden resistance at shallow depths, followed by hollow gaps beneath. He marked these areas in red ink, writing, "Pockets of air or voids, unnatural distribution." 2 days later, his survey map was misplaced. The town clerk's office insisted it was never submitted. As autumn set in, Father Lucas ceased holding public services entirely. The doors of the church remained locked, and a notice was posted, Liturgical operations suspended pending re-sanctification. No such process had been authorized by the diocese. Still, on multiple nights throughout October and November, faint light was observed through the stained glass windows after midnight. A handful of townspeople claimed to hear faint music. Organ chords slowed and fractured, punctuated by metallic clacks like chain links falling onto tile. Elias Thorne, who had remained in Coldwater under his false identity, attempted one final breach of the restricted areas. On November 18th, he entered the basement through a narrow coal chute at the rear, recently left unsecured. His last entry, scribbled in the margins of a hymnal he carried for cover, reads, "I am below. There are more boxes than the walls should hold. Some are embedded into the foundation. It smells of ink and burnt milk. There is humming, not mechanical, biological." He did not return to his lodging. 3 days later, his trunk was found intact, his belongings undisturbed. A letter addressed to his wife in Grand Rapids remained unposted, bearing only 4 words across the final page. They are not relics. The church remained silent throughout December. Snow accumulated against its facade. No parishioners returned. The Krieger boys were seen only once, pushing a covered cart along the main road at dusk, their eyes hollow and unfocused. That same week, the apothecary in town received an anonymous order for a full gallon of clove oil and 2 pounds of ground myrrh, both substances traditionally used to suppress the odor of decay. On January 8, 1888, the diocesan office in Detroit received an unsigned parcel containing only a folded length of velvet cloth, dark blue and stiff with dried oil. It was wrapped around a single item, a hand-carved crucifix measuring just under 9 inches, with no corpus, no nails, and no visible source of attachment to any base or altar. Along the back, beneath the arms, the initials SL were scorched into the wood. No accompanying letter, label, or request explained its origin. Though not overtly alarming in appearance, the item was never catalogued or displayed. Instead, it was locked in a private drawer in the bishop's archive, labeled Origin Unknown, no reply. By late January, snow blocked most routes to St. Odilo. With the main path obscured, Father Lucas was not seen outside for nearly 3 weeks. Deliveries to the church ceased, and the few townspeople who still paid attention assumed the parish had been quietly decommissioned. But on the night of February 2nd, a low whistle was heard by multiple households within 5 blocks of the grounds. It lasted nearly 2 minutes, rising in pitch until it faded into what several witnesses described as a thudding cough. The following morning, a fine layer of grey soot covered the stained glass windows from the inside. In Detroit, diocesan correspondence surrounding the Coldwater case became confused, fractured by internal contradictions. One memorandum, dated February 9th, referred to the planned reassignment of Father Lucas to Lansing, despite no such plan having been discussed previously. Another, from the same week, warned against contacting him altogether. "We have received no canonical updates on the matter of relic transport. Do not pursue further communication until instructed," it read with no signature or letterhead. Sister Adelind, the archivist, reportedly asked her superior whether any relics from St. Odilo had been approved for transfer or display since 1885. She was placed on administrative leave the following morning. As thaw approached, a new figure entered the town's orbit, Dr. Edwin Harrow, a medical examiner and amateur folklorist from Kalamazoo, who had corresponded briefly with Elias Thorne before his disappearance. Harrow arrived in March under the pretense of lecturing at the Coldwater Sanitary Commission, but made several quiet inquiries into the church and its history. He reviewed municipal death records, property deeds, and medical complaints filed by nearby residents. What he found was a strange statistical skew. From 1884 to 1887, residents within a half-mile radius of the church reported markedly higher incidence of night sweats, recurring tinnitus, and untraceable skin lesions. In most cases, symptoms dissipated within weeks of moving away. Harrow managed to speak with Otto Krieger, who by then was frail and nearly mute. The conversation, recorded in a letter Harrow later sent to a colleague, was fragmented. Otto responded in single words or gestures. When asked what he and his brother had been helping Father Lucas transport, he replied only, old teeth. When asked if they were human, he said, "Before." Harrow pressed further, but the interview ended when Otto began gagging, unprompted, as if choking on something unseen. He refused all further contact. That same month, Harrow attempted to access the church interior through the sacristy entrance, now overgrown with frost-damaged vines. The lock was fused shut, and the stone steps leading down to the entrance were soft with mildew. He was intercepted by a man he described as not quite young, not quite old, wearing an ecclesiastical collar with no corresponding records in the diocesan registry. The man introduced himself only as a custodian. Harrow asked to examine any of the relics still housed inside. The man replied, "They're not relics, they are fragments of a warning." The phrase matched that found in Thorne's final note. Rumors continued to mount. A woman named Joan Felder, who ran a bakery near the edge of town, claimed she saw 3 figures carrying a narrow wooden frame across the marsh toward the rear of the church. She said the figures walked silently in single file, barefoot despite the frost, and that they left no trail in the muddy ground. Her story was dismissed as fantasy, though it was consistent with an earlier account from a schoolboy who claimed he saw people moving like clock parts near the same location 1 month prior. On April 14, 1888, during a brief window of thaw, a group of city workers tasked with clearing the rear service road discovered a shallow ditch filled with discarded crates. Most had been broken open, their contents gone. One crate, however, remained intact, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth and bound with iron wire. Inside, beneath a crumbling sheaf of linen, were 12 irregular objects resembling carved wood, though each showed signs of having been subjected to extreme heat and pressure. A foreman touched one and immediately dropped it, reporting that it buzzed like a hornet's nest. By the time authorities arrived, the crate had been resealed and transported by 2 unknown men claiming jurisdiction on behalf of the bishop's office. No receipt was filed. The foreman who made contact with the item reported numbness in his left hand for several days and later developed a persistent cough. By May, a growing tension gripped the town. A petition signed by 13 residents demanded that the church be inspected by civil authorities for violations of public safety. It was sent to the county seat and ignored. Another was addressed to the bishop himself. No reply came. That summer, on June 2nd, a child named Henry Weaver vanished while playing near the overgrown fence bordering the churchyard. He had been collecting stones with a neighbor who turned away for no more than a minute. No scream, no sound. A full search was conducted, and dogs were brought in from Lansing, but the trail dissolved near a patch of blackened ground behind the sacristy. The soil in that section had hardened into a ceramic crust, immune to digging tools. The boy's hat was later found on the roof of the rectory, untouched by wind or water. After the incident, Father Lucas was seen only once, through the upper window of the bell tower, his face partially obscured by a curtain of yellowed lace. The image was described by a local teacher, Leonard Bass, who passed by at sunset and claimed the priest stood perfectly still, both hands held forward as if bracing against an invisible current. The tower had been sealed for nearly 4 years. By late summer, St. Odilo ceased to be spoken of openly. Businesses near the road began shuttering early. Children avoided the block entirely. The Krieger brothers stopped appearing in public. Those few who still remembered the earlier days of Father Lucas's ministry struggled to reconcile the quiet priest of old with the man who now existed only in glimpses and silence. His sermons, once dense and cryptic, were now non-existent. Yet inside the church something continued. Passers-by heard rhythmic thuds from within, like pulleys winding rope across rusted beams. On 2 occasions, faint singing was reported in the early morning, soft broken syllables rising and falling with no recognizable melody. One man, Abel Gunther, described it as a woman trying to remember a song she never learned. Then, on August 9, 1888, a new crate arrived. Unlike the others, it bore no stamp, no seal, no name. It was left at the rear of the property in the dead of night, observed only by a night watchman at the Coldwater Rail Depot. He described the deliveryman as dressed in clerical black, face concealed by a brimmed hat, walking beside the cart but never pushing it. The crate was taller than the others, wrapped in faded wool and made no sound when moved. It was brought inside before sunrise. On the morning of September 17, 1888, the silence surrounding St. Odilo was broken by an unauthorized entry. A man named Alphonse Grier, a fire marshal from Jackson County with a record of independent investigation, forced his way into the church under pretense of inspecting the foundation's stability after a minor earth tremor had been felt throughout Coldwater earlier that week. Grier arrived alone before dawn, equipped with only a lantern, a crowbar, and a notebook. What he documented over the next 2 hours, and what was later confirmed through photographic evidence, would never be officially acknowledged by the diocese. Grier's notes begin with the narthex, where he found all interior doors unlocked but slightly swollen from moisture. The air was dense and bitter, like scorched ink and fermented citrus. Dust motes floated in clumps, disturbed by no breeze. The sanctuary was unlit, except for the weak dawn light filtering through the high windows, casting misshapen colors across the pews. The crates once seen stacked against the walls were gone. In their place stood 12 wooden pedestals, each roughly waist-high, ringed with melted wax and stained linen bands, as if something had been restrained there and removed. Grier wrote, "The wood looks scorched in rings, as if from chains drawn too tightly around heated metal." From the nave he proceeded to the sacristy, where records had supposedly been kept. The room was stripped bare, cabinet doors hung open and warped. The floor was littered with broken ink bottles and scraps of water-damaged paper. Beneath one cabinet, Grier found a book with a cover of coarse linen instead of leather. Its pages were stuck together, but on the inner flap was a faint inscription in black wax, "Testament of Transport, Lucas." Turning to the rectory, Grier followed a corridor lined with rough plaster and what he described as small indentations spaced at odd intervals, as if something had been repeatedly pressed against the walls. At the far end, the door to the rectory's rear chamber was wedged shut. He forced it open with his crowbar and entered a narrow room with no windows, its walls hung with thick drapes soaked in oil. The floor was bare except for a central depression, circular, lined with metal trays, each filled with a dark, tar-like substance. Above it, mounted on the ceiling with iron hooks, hung a cradle-like structure fashioned from stripped-down pew parts, bent and nailed into place. Dried residue, black and clotted, marked the interior. Beneath it, the floor showed signs of repeated burning. Grier noted, "This is no cradle of comfort. This is for containment, or conversion." The real discovery came when he located the entrance to the sealed basement. A broken chain lay beside a splintered doorframe behind the old reliquary alcove. The stairwell descended into total darkness, lined with damp stone and metal piping that groaned softly with changes in air pressure. Grier lit his lantern and stepped down. What he found below shifted the investigation from the speculative to the undeniable. The basement extended far beyond the known footprint of the church. Grier counted 17 vault-like rooms, some no larger than a cupboard, others stretching long and narrow like livestock corridors. The walls were unfinished, marked with scorings in patterns he could not decipher, clusters of triangles, tally-like strokes, and what he described as crosses interrupted mid-arm as if drawn while trembling. The further he walked, the warmer the air became, carrying the scent of sulfur, burned bone, and damp wool. Drips echoed across the passage from unseen sources. In the 6th chamber, Grier found remnants of what had once been a library. Books scorched at the edges, some reduced to carbon slivers. One intact ledger sat atop a makeshift lectern. It was written entirely in German and Italian, filled with diagrams and inventory descriptions. One passage included precise measurements of a shipment received in 1886, described as calcified specimens of failed reverence, reclaimed from Aquileia. The page bore a red stamp, not for communion. Another page detailed preservation techniques involving ash suspension, slow heat, and saturation with oils drawn from saints not yet venerated. In the 9th chamber, he encountered bodies. 4 wooden crates, each partially unsealed, contained what remained of men and women preserved in unnatural contortions. Their skin, where visible, had darkened and cracked like overbaked clay. Their jaws were held open by rusted wire. The eyes, in every case, had been removed and replaced with small waxen spheres. On their chests lay tokens, wooden slivers carved with indecipherable glyphs and tied with strands of human hair. Greer did not touch them. His entry in the notebook reads only, "They were prepared but not for burial." The final chamber, buried deepest beneath the sacristy, contained no furnishings, no tools, no crates. Only a circular pit, perfectly symmetrical, filled halfway with a silvery fluid that neither reflected light nor cast shadow. Along the rim, shallow bowls had been set into the ground, each stained with the blackened remains of something once organic. The smell here was overpowering, bitter, sweet, nauseating. Greer wrote, "The closer I stand, the more I feel the pulse in my teeth." He dropped a scrap of cloth into the liquid and observed no ripple. When he reached to retrieve it, he pulled back his hand, saying it had grown unbearably cold without temperature. At this point, Greer left the basement. His final note, "There are no relics here. There are residues." When he emerged, the church above remained quiet, unchanged. But outside, a small crowd had gathered. Townspeople, alerted by the forced entry, stood at a distance. Among them was Leonard Bass, the schoolteacher, who approached and asked if Greer had found the priest. Greer replied that he had not. No trace of Father Lucas had been found anywhere in the building. Later that day, law enforcement from the county seat arrived to investigate. By then, Greer's notes had already been sent to his office in Jackson by courier. Deputies entered the church in pairs, each reporting difficulty breathing within 15 minutes. No one descended into the basement. The stairwell was found collapsed, the path sealed with charred wood and masonry debris that showed no sign of natural failure. When questioned, no official would state whether the pit or the contents of the lower chambers had been seen. All references to the discovery were redacted in the final report filed with the county, but not all documents disappeared. An assistant to Greer, who later published his own pamphlet under a pseudonym, claimed to have seen photographs of the basement taken by Greer hours before his report was confiscated. He described one image in particular, a figure seated on the floor of the relic chamber, limbs folded unnaturally, surrounded by open books and a circle of jars. The face was blurred, not from movement, but from chemical damage on the plate. The assistant believed it to be Father Lucas. The original glass negative was never located. The church was officially shuttered by order of the County Health Commissioner on October 3, 1888, citing structural unsoundness and airborne toxins. The Krieger brothers were taken into custody, but released within days deemed unfit for formal questioning. They were admitted to a sanitarium in Battle Creek, where they refused to speak of their time at the church. One died that winter. The other disappeared from his room in June 1889, leaving only an oil-stained cloth on his bed. By then, no one in Coldwater referred to the building by name. Children were forbidden to approach it. Property values in the vicinity plummeted. The bishopric, under new leadership, offered no public statement. But beneath the silence the records remained, and the ledger, blackened at the corners, held one final line: reclaimed, sealed, not resolved. After the closure of St. Odilo in early October 1888, its outer gates were chained and the diocesan crest removed from above the main door. Yet despite official orders, no structural demolition was scheduled. The building stood, inert and guarded, with no indication of future plans. A single notice on the iron fence read, "Closed pending reassessment," but no reassessment ever occurred. From within, faint sounds continued to trouble the nearby streets, low rhythmic creaks, as if wood were shifting under unseen weight. In late October, a team from the Michigan Geological Survey, unrelated to any religious authority, arrived in Coldwater with permission to study the unusual subsidence patterns surrounding the church. Headed by Dr. Albert Fenwick, a surveyor known for meticulous records, the team established a perimeter and installed underground probes designed to monitor soil movement and temperature. Within 2 days, the equipment began returning inconsistent data. One probe beneath the eastern transept registered interior soil temperatures of 117 degrees Fahrenheit, despite ambient autumn air. Another set behind the collapsed stairwell reported subterranean vibrations every 3 hours, lasting precisely 13 seconds. Fenwick's journal recorded these anomalies with scientific neutrality, but one entry, dated November 1st, diverged in tone. The patterns are not tectonic, they are deliberate. Something below is responding to weight above, like a lung, inhaling when stepped upon. That night, he and his assistant, Martin Dowes, camped beside the sacristy wall. Dowes would later write in a private letter, "We heard it. Twice. A distant grind, then what sounded like 4 knocks. Even Fenwick turned pale." 2 days later, while conducting a soil extraction from beneath the nave, Fenwick's drill struck metal. Expecting foundation debris, he excavated further. What he uncovered was not part of the church's structure, but a cylindrical canister, capped with a wax seal, encased in what appeared to be linen soaked in resin. Inside were rolled pages of parchment, brittle and water-stained. Though many were illegible, one was preserved enough to identify a passage written in Latin, "Not relics but remainder, not sanctified but abandoned, touch only in preparation." No name was attached. The find was quietly sent to the University of Michigan for further analysis and was never returned to Coldwater. Public concern grew after this. Despite the town's general silence, rumors circulated about lingering illness among those living closest to the site. 2 schoolteachers reported unprovoked nosebleeds during class. A postal worker began to suffer persistent vertigo only while walking past the church gate. By mid-November, 3 more residents had moved out of the neighborhood entirely. One man, Leonard Bass, the same teacher who'd once seen Father Lucas in the tower, attempted to burn the remaining photographs he had taken of the church. When asked why, he said, "I developed them twice, and the second set were different. The shadows were in new places. The windows showed rooms I didn't remember." Efforts to seal off the basement were quietly renewed. On November 14th, a contracting team sent by the diocese arrived under cover of darkness. They were not local, and none would speak with reporters or townspeople. That evening, heavy tools were heard inside. Sparks lit up the upper windows. But when the team returned the following morning to finish the job, they found the entire western interior flooded with a thick, tar-like substance, hardened into a brittle crust. One man attempted to chip through it with a pickaxe. The blade snapped. The substance was sent to a chemist in Battle Creek who returned the sample with a note: "Organic, but not sap. No known plant base. Possibly degraded animal protein with high metallic salt content." The sample disintegrated within 48 hours. The final confrontation occurred on the night of December 3, 1888. A group of 4 men, Fenwick, Dowes, a county surveyor named Harold Sims, and an unknown individual introduced only as Father Elias, entered the church with the express intent to retrieve whatever documents or materials remained in the basement. The entry was not sanctioned. The records of the event exist only in the form of a series of transcripts compiled from surviving testimonies, letters, and one unfiled police report retrieved decades later. According to these sources, the men entered through a side aperture created during earlier foundation work. They descended a narrow shaft and reached the lower chambers by crawling across a network of half-collapsed tunnels. Dowes noted a change in temperature immediately. The heat didn't rise, it pressed, like being submerged in warm cloth. Inside, they found that the circular pit Greer had documented had changed. It was empty now, but lined with rows of burnt indentations, as if something had been removed violently or had fled on its own. The books were gone. The metal trays had been shattered. But one object remained, a frame of latticewood standing upright against the far wall. It resembled an altar in form, but had no surface, only vertical rods with tiny pins still dangling from their ends. Beneath it, 7 scorched tokens lay arranged in a semicircle. Each was marked with a single number carved by hand, unevenly into the wood: 2, 3, 4, 6, 9, 11, 13. Dowes began photographing the room, but reported that the flash powder failed to ignite. Father Elias stood silently for several minutes before stepping into the semicircle. He reached toward the lattice. In every account, what happened next came without sound. The wall behind the altar seemed to retract slightly, not crumble or break, but shift inward by a fraction. A thin stream of black liquid trickled down the right-hand corner, steaming where it touched the floor. Elias fell backward instantly. No one saw him touch the structure. Sims dragged him up and out, and the group exited in silence. Elias never regained consciousness. He died 2 days later of cardiac failure. His body, when prepared for burial, was found to have deep burns along the soles of his feet and the backs of his hands, though he had worn boots and gloves during the descent. His death marked the end of all efforts to reclaim or study the site. The diocese ordered the remaining entrance points filled with cement and ordered a high fence erected around the property. The town of Coldwater received a grant for beautification of public land in early 1889, and St. Odilo was quietly deconsecrated. No formal announcement was ever made. No clergy were assigned to replace Father Lucas. His name was removed from parish registries. In the years that followed, nature slowly reclaimed the outer grounds. The marshland returned, thick and pungent. The building, left unattended, began to sink. By 1896, its bell tower was visibly tilting westward, its bricks split by root systems from nearby trees. Children growing up in the area were taught not to ask about it. Few of them did. But inside the diocesan archives, where certain files were kept under restricted access, the name Lucas Silas remained active. Beneath it a single note: objects never confirmed, origin unknown, effects ongoing. In the months following the final descent into St. Odilo's lower chambers, official language around the church turned vague and procedural. There was no mention of Father Lucas's whereabouts in any diocesan circulars. No trial was held. No arrest was ever issued. The building remained standing, sealed off by order of both the bishopric and the county health office, but no charges were filed against any clerical figure. By January 1889, Coldwater residents began to understand that silence was the church's preferred method of closure. The Krieger family was removed from public record. After Otto's disappearance from the Battle Creek Sanitarium, their last known surviving relative, a cousin in Monroe, filed to have their family name expunged from several property deeds. The request was granted. In the town's municipal archive, their old house is listed as vacant structure slated for removal, though no removal was scheduled. It burned to the ground the following winter during a lightning storm. No cause was listed. With the rectory and church grounds no longer in use, the neighborhood surrounding St. Odilo saw gradual depopulation. By the spring of 1889, 5 businesses within 2 blocks of the building had closed, citing poor foot traffic and the persistent smell that lingered near the foundation. Residents reported that even after the sealing of the basement, the earth around the nave remained soft year-round. Gardening was impossible. Laundry lines sagged in the still air, collecting black dust that seemed to settle at dusk. In April, a formal letter was submitted to the state legislature by a small coalition of Coldwater citizens, requesting a reassessment of religious property tax exemptions. The petition referenced improper use of parish resources, failure of ecclesiastical accountability, and ongoing public health hazard. The letter was not acknowledged, and no vote was taken. However, it triggered an internal diocesan audit, which yielded a single irregularity. A ledger entry for the year 1886 listed a purchase made by St. Odilo under the name Sanctum Transporter. The vendor was an Italian shipping agent operating in Venice, who had died in 1882. The address was falsified, the receipt was stamped paid. When the results of the audit reached the bishop's office, all files related to the church were marked inactive and transferred to an off-site facility. Several pages were destroyed. This was confirmed by a clerk, Mildred LaRue, who would later testify anonymously in a journalistic exposé printed in 1895 under the title "The Oil at Our Feet." LaRue described having been asked to burn 5 envelopes of documents in the rectory fireplace one evening in March. She followed instructions and never returned to work. Nationally, the Coldwater case gained brief attention during a closed-door inquiry into relic trafficking among American parishes. That same year, Father Elias's death was reviewed by a commission which found no fault and listed his passing as natural causes under stress. However, his personal effects, including an annotated missal, 2 Latin codices and a pocket rosary with missing beads, were misplaced during transfer to the Archdiocese of Chicago. The missal was later found in a private collection belonging to a retired seminary rector, its margins covered in ash-colored smears. Public reaction in Coldwater grew quiet, not due to satisfaction, but exhaustion. The church's shadow lingered. Former parishioners refused interviews. Some left town entirely. Those who stayed shifted routes, built fences, and watched their children more closely. The schoolhouse near the marsh closed in 1890 and was replaced with a wool factory whose workers complained regularly of respiratory irritation. Production halted in under 2 years. The building still stands, unused. Between 1890 and 1896, at least 7 attempts were made to purchase the church property. Every offer was declined or stalled by unclear deed language, jurisdictional complications, or sudden withdrawal. One investor from Lansing, Albert J. Hines, made 2 formal inquiries and even visited the site. Afterward, he withdrew his interest without explanation and refused to speak of the visit again. A letter later found in his papers read only, "The ground knocks. I cannot build where it remembers." In 1892, a child wandering near the gate fell and fractured his leg. While recovering, he claimed that the church's bell rang for him. When his mother asked what he meant, he said, "It rang without sound. I heard it in my ribs." No one had entered the tower in 6 years. The final visible change came in 1896. One morning in June, townspeople noticed that the stained glass windows had been removed. No glass fragments were found nearby, and the frames remained intact. It appeared as if each pane had been lifted out cleanly from within. Behind the hollow spaces, only blackness was visible despite full sun. That evening, the marsh behind the church bubbled, releasing a plume of warm air that carried the scent of burnt cloves and vinegar. No official statement followed. By then, no one asked for one. As the century closed, the legacy of St. Odilo was absorbed into half-formed stories, passed in fragments. Some said it was once a hospital for the deranged. Others believed it had been a foreign cult headquarters repurposed by the church. The truth, faint, documented, and increasingly brittle, was buried in archives and whispered between archivists. Those who knew the details seldom repeated them, and those who learned them often found reason to forget. But one document remained unaccounted for, the final page of the relic ledger. Its location was unknown until 1899, when a house fire in Port Huron led to the discovery of a locked trunk among salvaged belongings. Inside were various priestly garments, a melted oil lamp, and a charred page sealed in wax. The writing was still legible. It read, "Do not exhume. They were not buried. They were kept." By the final years of the 19th century, St. Odilo was no longer referenced in public records by name. Instead, the site appeared in property assessments as Parcel 93B, a numerical designation that omitted all reference to its original function. The diocesan map of Coldwater, once printed annually with detailed parish boundaries, showed only a blank square where the church had stood. A notation in fine print below the legend read, "Inactive. Officiation privileges revoked." The structure itself still loomed, but now shrouded in overgrowth and heavy moss, as though the land itself had grown impatient with waiting. Trees leaned against its walls. The ground around it became spongy and treacherous, especially in late spring. Children dared one another to approach, but never crossed the threshold. Some said they heard voices beneath the earth when they got too close, not shouts, but soft pleading, as though something unseen was begging not to be remembered. In 1897, a regional census taker named Conrad Peabody documented a series of abandoned plots in the vicinity of the church. Among his notes was a marginal sketch of the building's north face, where a series of vertical grooves had appeared in the brick. Peabody believed them to be scars from lightning strikes or poor mortar work, but added one remark, circled in pencil. "Some run horizontal, some vertical, all too deep for weather alone." He did not include the sketch in his final report, and his copy was filed without annotation. Peabody died the following year of pleurisy. His journal was donated to the Kalamazoo Historical Society, where it remains locked in a drawer, inaccessible to the public. By the close of 1898, only a handful of living residents in Coldwater still claimed to have known Father Lucas personally. The few who did refused interviews. One, a retired organist named Ruth Meyer, wrote a single sentence in a letter to her niece in Ypsilanti. "He was kind until he wasn't, and then he was very quiet." No further mention was made of the church or its history in their correspondence. Within religious institutions, the story of St. Odilo was reduced to an internal lesson in decentralized clerical autonomy, a term used in seminary lectures to warn against unsupervised liturgical practices. The term replaced heresy in official language. The phrase Father Lucas became a cautionary reference, usually without elaboration. When questioned, instructors advised students to focus on Scripture and leave buried histories to those who buried them. But the questions never disappeared completely. They surfaced in footnotes, unpublished essays, and the journals of archivists who had heard whispers but found no documents to confirm them. One such archivist, Helena Drumright of Chicago, submitted a private inquiry to the Vatican in 1898, requesting guidance on what she described as unresolved contamination in the classification of devotional artifacts. Her letter included 3-item descriptions matching objects found at St. Odilo. The response came 6 months later. It was handwritten in Latin and signed only with a cross. It read, "You are not to inquire further. Keep silence and observe from afar. There are still things that listen." Drumright left her position 2 weeks after receiving the letter. Her resignation note, preserved in a personnel file, stated only, "The archive cannot forget what the earth has memorized." Meanwhile, the church building, though untouched by man, continued to change in ways not easily explained. In the winter of 1898, snowfall around its foundation failed to accumulate. Townspeople noticed that birds no longer perched on its roof. Even the moss along the base seemed to wither and blacken, as if rejecting the structure it had once embraced. A local botanist theorized that minerals leaching from the basement walls had altered the pH of the surrounding soil, though no samples were taken to confirm this. When asked, he admitted he had never entered the grounds. In late December of that year, a group of 6 men hired by a speculative developer from Toledo attempted to access the building for appraisal. They brought axes, lanterns, and a team of horses. The iron gates had rusted shut, and the front door remained fused. After several hours, one of the men, an unnamed laborer from Monroe, wandered alone toward the rear apse and did not return. The rest of the group found him standing knee-deep in marsh water, staring at the reflection of the church in the pool. When asked what he was doing, he responded, "There's another one underneath it, but it's wrong." The Toledo developer abandoned the purchase. In early 1899, an archivist from Saginaw named Franklin Mears published a private monograph titled The Uncatalogued, a collection of case studies involving unidentified relics found in American churches. One chapter was dedicated to Coldwater. Mears never named the church directly, but described a parish on reclaimed ground where veneration turned to containment. The chapter included transcriptions of 2 documents believed to have originated from St. Odilo. One a donation list without donors, the other a relic treatment procedure written in alternating lines of English and poor Latin. The latter contained repeated instructions to seal in warmth and prevent return. Mears mailed copies of his monograph to 6 academic libraries. Only one acknowledged receipt. The others reported never receiving them. In his personal correspondence, Mears wrote, "It is not a story, it is a condition, one that must be avoided, not forgotten." He died of a pulmonary embolism 1 month later. The church itself still stood at the end of that year, cracked, half swallowed by the earth, empty of human use. The bell tower had lost its roof. The eastern wall had buckled. The fence remained in place, bent in 2 corners where animals had pressed through. Those who passed by said they could still feel the air change near the property, thicker, slower, as if sound itself moved differently. And in one final quiet entry in the town's maintenance log, dated December 31st, 1899, a street cleaner noted an odd incident near the boundary of the church. He had been sweeping the curb after the frost lifted when he found a small object tucked into a crack in the stone. It was a sliver of scorched wood no bigger than a finger, wrapped with a strand of blonde hair. He threw it into the ditch and walked away. But when he returned the next morning, another had appeared. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way, we'll know how far these stories reach. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.